Nobody in the room saw it coming. Not the bartender who had been wiping the same glass for 3 minutes straight, watching the door out of the corner of his eye. Not the 2 men playing dominoes in the back, pieces clicking against the table with mechanical rhythm. Not the old woman selling newspapers just outside, who had learned long ago to disappear when certain cars pulled up to certain corners. Nobody saw it coming, and that was exactly the problem. Because when a man does something unforgivable in plain sight, and nobody does anything about it, the thing that dies is not just the dignity of the person it happened to. What dies is the understanding that there are still consequences in this world, that somewhere, somehow, there is still a line. There are still rules even the powerful are afraid to cross. What dies is the idea that someone, somewhere, will stand up. On a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1952, in a Harlem street that smelled of roasted peanuts and engine exhaust, a man in a cream-colored suit crossed that line. He crossed it in front of 30 people. He crossed it in front of a child. And every single person on that block held their breath, because they all knew the same thing. Only one man in Harlem could respond to what had just happened. And they prayed, quietly, desperately, that he was nearby. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but nobody called him that. Not the police who had arrested him 14 times and convicted him 0. Not the Italian families who controlled most of the organized crime on the East Coast, the men who had learned, slowly and painfully, that Harlem was not theirs to touch. Not the politicians who shook his hand in back rooms and pretended not to know who he was in public, and certainly not the people of Harlem, who had a different name for him entirely. They called him Bumpy, and in 1952, that name meant something very specific. It meant that if you were a numbers runner and the police shook you down, there was someone to call. It meant that if your landlord decided to triple your rent in January with no warning and nowhere to go, there was someone who would have a conversation with that landlord. It meant that if a man from outside the neighborhood came into Harlem thinking the rules that applied everywhere else did not apply here, someone would correct that misunderstanding personally. Bumpy Johnson was not a good man in the way that word is usually understood. He had done things that would make most people look away. He did not apologize for what he was, but he operated according to a code. A set of principles so deeply engraved in how he moved through the world that crossing them was not just a moral offense. It was a tactical error of the highest order. The first principle was simple: you do not touch children. The second was even simpler: you do not disrespect the people of Harlem in Harlem. Not in the street, not in front of witnesses, not ever. The man in the cream-colored suit had just violated both principles at the same time. His name was Carmine. Last names were not important because men like him preferred it that way, and because by the end of that week, what his last name was would matter far less than what had happened on that Tuesday afternoon. Carmine was connected. Connected in the way that word carries weight in 1952 New York, which meant he had never once in his adult life worried about consequences the way ordinary people did. He had people for problems. He had envelopes for police captains. He had lawyers who answered the phone on Sunday mornings. He was not the top of the organization, but he was high enough that he had started to believe that geography had no authority over him, that Harlem was just a neighborhood, just streets and buildings and people, just a place he could pass through on his way somewhere else without adjusting his behavior. He had come to collect a debt. The debt was legitimate, at least within the moral universe these men occupied. It was owed by a man who operated a small gambling establishment on 133rd Street, and Carmine had come to remind him of that fact in person, because reminders delivered in person tend to be more effective than those delivered by telephone. He had collected the debt. Everything was going smoothly. He was walking back to his car, and then a child ran into him. She was 9 years old. Her name was Ruth. She had been chasing a ball that had rolled off the sidewalk, and she came around the corner without looking, and she ran directly into Carmine's side, and the impact made him spill a small amount of coffee on his cream-colored sleeve. It was an accident. It was clearly and obviously and completely an accident. Any person with functional eyes and a functioning conscience could see that immediately. Carmine looked down at his sleeve. He looked at the child, and then he said the word, loudly, in the street, in front of 30 people, looking directly at a 9-year-old girl. The word landed like a physical thing, like something with weight and velocity. Ruth froze. She did not cry. She was too stunned to cry. She just looked up at him with an expression that no 9-year-old should ever have to produce. The word echoed off the buildings, off the awnings, off the windows, off the faces of every person who had heard it. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then someone, somewhere in that crowd, said 2 words very quietly. "Get Bumpy." He was 3 blocks away. He was sitting in a barber shop, not in the chair but on the bench by the window, reading a newspaper, wearing a dark suit and a hat that he had not removed because he planned to be somewhere else in 20 minutes. The man who came to get him was a teenager named Calvin, who ran errands for 3 different people in the neighborhood, and who arrived slightly out of breath, not from the distance but from the urgency. He leaned down and said something in a low voice. The barber stopped cutting mid-stroke. The man in the chair closed his eyes. Bumpy lowered the newspaper. He looked at Calvin. He asked one question. "Is the child hurt?" Calvin said she was not hurt physically, just shaken. Bumpy folded the newspaper. He placed it on the bench with the kind of deliberate care a person uses when they are making a decision about something that has nothing to do with newspapers. He stood. He adjusted his hat. He walked to the door and he held it open briefly. And in that moment, every person in that barbershop understood that whatever was about to happen 3 blocks away was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be a correction. Carmine was still on the block. He had not rushed back to his car because men like him did not rush. Rushing implied fear, and fear was a language he had decided years ago he would not speak in public. He was speaking to his driver, standing beside the car, and when he saw the man walking toward him from down the block, he did not immediately understand what he was seeing. He saw a man in a dark suit, medium height, not large, not the kind of physical presence that typically preceded trouble in Carmine's experience. He had expected, if anything came at all, something louder, something with more people behind it. He did not understand yet that Bumpy Johnson had never needed more than himself. Bumpy walked until he was standing at a distance of about 6 feet from Carmine. He stopped. He looked at him for a moment with the kind of patience that is more unsettling than anger. The patience of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Then he said, "I heard what you said. Just that. Nothing more." Carmine understood who this was now. His driver had gone very still. A crowd had formed along the sidewalk the way crowds form when they sense that history is being made in front of them. Carmine made a calculation. He was connected. He had people. He had envelopes. He had lawyers. He said, "It was nothing. I was irritated." Bumpy nodded slowly as if he were processing something with great care. He said, "I know you were irritated. That's the part I understand. What I don't understand is why you thought it was acceptable to say that word to a child on a street in my neighborhood." There was no threat in his voice. There was something worse than a threat. There was certainty. The certainty of a man who knows exactly what he is and exactly what he is capable of and has no need to advertise either. Carmine said, "Look, Johnson, this doesn't have to become something." Bumpy said, "It already became something. The moment the word left your mouth, it became something. The only question now is what it becomes next." He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the crowd. He found Ruth standing near the edge, being held by an older woman. He looked at her for several seconds. Then he turned back to Carmine and he said, "Apologize to her. Not quietly. Here. Now. In front of all these people." Carmine's jaw tightened. Bumpy watched him. The driver watched the street. The crowd watched everything. Carmine said quietly, "This is going to cause problems." Bumpy said, "You already caused the problem. I'm offering you the solution." Carmine looked at the crowd. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Bumpy. And something in the calculation shifted, because whatever protection he thought he had, whatever weight his connections carried, they did not carry it here. They did not carry it on this block, in this neighborhood, in front of this man, and he understood that, finally. He walked to Ruth. He crouched down slightly, which was perhaps the most honest gesture he had made in years. He said, "I'm sorry. I was wrong to say what I said." Ruth looked at him with 8 years more wisdom than her age should have allowed and said nothing. She did not have to. The apology was not really for her. It was for every person on that block. It was for Harlem. And Bumpy made sure everyone could hear it. Carmine left. His car turned the corner and the sound of the engine faded, and the block slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though not entirely. Not right away, because what had just happened needed a few minutes to settle into the air before life could resume around it. Bumpy did not make a speech. He did not raise his fist. He did not look at the crowd for approval. He walked to Ruth and knelt down until he was at eye level with her. He said, "What he said was not about you. Do you understand that? Nothing that man said had anything to do with who you are." Ruth was still processing. She nodded because she trusted the man speaking and because she was 9 years old and would understand more of it later, when the memory had time to breathe. Bumpy said, "You are from Harlem. That means something." Ruth said, "What does it mean?" Bumpy thought about that for a moment, genuinely thought about it, and said, "It means that when someone tries to make you small, there are 30 people on this block alone who will make sure you remember how tall you actually are." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He walked back up the block toward the barber shop because he had left his newspaper on the bench and he liked to finish things he had started. What happened next was not immediate. It never is, with men like Carmine and the organizations behind them. What happened was several conversations in several rooms over several days. Messages were sent through intermediaries because that was how these things were done. Bumpy received one such message from a man 2 levels above Carmine who wanted to express that the situation had been handled internally and that there would not be a repeat occurrence and that it was hoped this matter would be considered resolved. Bumpy sent back a response through the same intermediaries. The response was 2 sentences long. He said that the matter was not resolved. It was suspended. He said that if anything resembling a repeat occurrence ever happened in Harlem again, from any person connected to any organization, there would be no more intermediaries. Nobody misunderstood what he meant. Nobody tested it. The cream-colored suit was never seen in Harlem again. Carmine was relocated to a role in a different borough, which in the language of those organizations meant he had become a problem that had been managed. Whether this happened because of what he had said or because of what it had cost them, nobody said publicly. It did not matter. The result was the same. There is something that happens in a neighborhood when someone crosses a line and something is done about it. It is not celebration, exactly. It is something quieter than that. It is the reaffirmation of a shared understanding that there are still boundaries, that the world is not completely without structure, that dignity is not just a word people use when they have no power, but something that can actually be defended. The people on that block on that Tuesday afternoon did not need to talk about it much afterward. They did not need to analyze what had happened. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had seen a man in a cream-colored suit say the worst word in the American language to a child on their street. And they had seen another man respond to it, not with violence, not with chaos, but with something more precise than either of those things, with the demand of accountability, with the insistence that an apology be given publicly because the harm had been done publicly, and private apologies for public wounds are not justice, they are convenience. And they had seen it work. That is the part that people remember longest, not the confrontation, the part where it worked. Ruth grew up in Harlem. She told this story when she was in her 60s, at a community meeting, to a room full of young people who had grown up hearing the name Bumpy Johnson as something between legend and myth. She said that she did not remember everything about that day. She was 9, and it had happened fast, and parts of it had been replaced by how other people described it to her over the years. But she remembered one thing perfectly. She remembered looking up at Carmine when he gave her the apology, and seeing behind him, at the edge of the crowd, a man in a dark suit watching her. Not watching Carmine, watching her, making sure she was all right. She said, he was not looking to see if Carmine had done the right thing. He already knew Carmine would do it. He was looking at me to see if I was going to be okay. She paused. She said, "That's what power actually looks like, not the part where you make someone do something. The part where, after it's done, you're still paying attention to the person who got hurt." The room was quiet when she finished. Then someone near the back asked, "Did you ever speak to him again?" She thought for a moment. She said, "He came to my mother's church the following Sunday. He sat in the back. He left before the end of the service. He didn't talk to anyone." She shook her head slowly. "He just came." I think that was his way of saying the neighborhood was still the neighborhood, still safe, still his to protect. She looked at the young faces around the room. She said, "You should know where you come from. You should know the names of the people who held this place together when the whole world was trying to take it apart. Not because they were perfect, they weren't, but because they understood something most people never figure out, that the line between who has power and who doesn't is not drawn by money or muscle or connections. It's drawn by who is willing to stand on a street corner in front of 30 people and say, 'Not here, not this, not to one of ours.' That man stood on that corner, and Harlem is still here because of it. His full name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him Bumpy. He was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, moved to Harlem as a teenager, and ran its streets for 4 decades. He died in 1968 of heart failure at a restaurant he frequented on 125th Street. He is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. On his gravestone it says, "Beloved husband and father." But in Harlem, what it says in the hearts of the people who knew what he did and why he did it is something different. In Harlem, what it says is simpler than that. It says, he was here. It says, when it mattered, he showed up. It says, not on our street, not to one of ours. If this story made you think about what it means to protect a community, about the difference between power and authority, about the men and women who held the world together in places history forgot to look, then this is your channel. Subscribe now, because here we don't follow trends and we don't follow the easy version of the past. We follow the truth, even when the truth is complicated. Activate the bell so you never miss a story. And remember this: the most important thing you will ever protect is not your reputation. It is the dignity of the people standing next to you.